The Agenda with Michael Knight on News Radio 560 KPQ and KPQ.com.
1:34 in the afternoon. Good afternoon to you. If you're just joining us, let's meet our very special guest, Mike Steele, candidate and incumbent for the 12th Legislative District. Mike Steele, welcome to KPQ. Good to have you on the air once again.
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Candidacy time. The hat is thrown into the ring one more time. Does it seem like something's wrong with the election cycle? Didn't you just do this?
It does seem like we just finished the last cycle, yes. Every other year, you're kind of in the hot seat again.
Well, do you enjoy campaigning?
You know, I enjoy being in the legislature.
That's a fair answer. That would have been my answer.
It's been a very rewarding and fulfilling opportunity to serve the people of the 12th District as I come toward the last 6 months of my first term, hopeful to run and be elected for a second term in the State House. There's a lot of work left to be done. And frankly, 2 short years is not enough to accomplish all that I hope to set out to do. We still have a lot of great policy work to do. We still have a lot of work in the state in general to do, and I hope to do that as I return to the legislature.
How much of those 2 years was work that you wanted to do on behalf of your constituents and then work that you simply had to do because it was the job?
Well, I think most folks know that I serve on several fairly significant committees in the state, education regarding the K-12 system, and then the capital budget, as well as technology and economic development. And, of course, everyone's familiar with several major issues that we did have to deal with at the legislature. Of course, Hearst, the water fix, very important, and the capital budget, which sort of was interlinked, if you will.
Everything was tied together, wasn't it?
Everything was tied together. And, of course, we came back to this last session and within a couple of weeks had both the capital budget passed and the Hearst bill or Hearst fix finished and wrapped up as well and sent to the governor's desk for effect. It took effect January 19th of this year.
And does that Hearst decision satisfy you?
It certainly did. We came out very, very positively here in the 12th Legislative District. The water usage and the hydrology in general of Washington State, but specifically in the 12th District, was of major concern to me. I mean, we are amazing stewards of our water here. As we are an agrarian and farming society, we really know how to take care of water. And some of the implications of the original Hearst decision were going to have major, major negative effects on the 12th Legislative District. So the bill that we ultimately passed did have major wins, not only for our district, but the whole of Washington State. Now, there are several districts and several counties across the state that are going to have to continue to deal with the impacts of in-stream flows and what that looks like, but we've mitigated for those inside the capital budget, put about $300 million in the capital budget to deal with some of those issues. And we really do, I think, have a responsibility to understand the hydrology in this state. If we're going to expect our counties to hand out permits, we need to understand what's underneath and what's flowing and where the water rights are and where they aren't. And I think we certainly came up with a good solution for that, and I'm excited to see that move forward. Do I think the conversation is over? Absolutely not. I think we'll be dealing with water and water rights for quite some time.
Is that just because the two sides of the state don't understand one another, or is it because it's such a complicated issue that the non-agricultural based people who have an opinion about this managed to come up with one that doesn't seem to work for a farmer?
I think that's a great question. You've sort of stumbled onto exactly the point. This is not an issue of Republicans versus Democrats. It's not a partisan issue at all. It's actually urban versus rural and the needs associated with the usage of water in a rural community or a rural district versus water usage in an urban setting. So you had a really interesting dichotomy occurring at the legislature where you had the urban legislators talking about all the water that they need, and they were fine with building 12,000 new units in downtown Seattle for the next 5 years and pulling water from watersheds that didn't belong to them and simultaneously trying to shut down watersheds in eastern Washington that didn't have nearly the in-stream flow impacts that we were seeing in the urban areas. So it was a long and very complicated process, as you know, and you followed here in the news studio. But we came to a conclusion, and we were very happy with it, and we're excited to move forward. But again, it's not going to be the last we hear of water right discussions and water usage in Washington State.
Also, for people who don't follow the droughts that are going on around us, you can't just say there's going to be a lot of water here forever.
No, you can't.
That's the wrong attitude.
That's right. You have to understand the hydrology of this state, and that's very, very important. And that's why I was in support, as someone who sits on the capital budget, of putting money into the capital budget to truly understand what hydrology looks like in Washington State.
One other big issue seems to be solved now between schools, the Supreme Court, and everybody else who lives and works in this state. Can you tell us how that came down?
Very exciting. Just got word this morning that we've satisfied the McCleary mandate by the Supreme Court So we're no longer under the $100,000 penalty per day. The court has lifted that, which is very exciting. And, it's sort of kind of met underneath the radar, if you will. There wasn't a whole lot of fanfare about the announcement, but it's happened. McCleary has been satisfied. And now, as I've said very publicly over the last several years while serving in the legislature, I'm excited that McCleary is behind us because now I'm ready to focus on student outcomes and successes. Because as someone who serves on the K through 12 Education Committee, that's what we should be concerned with. We're putting over 50% of our general fund budget toward education. And as a state that spends more on the education arena than any other area, we should be seeing great successes for our students. And I just don't think we've reached that. And I don't think the teachers or the students have the resources they need to continue reaching the success that I want to see. So we'll go back to the legislature and continue to work on policy that really focuses on student outcomes.
Now, I know the funding of the schools was really a question because it was such a complicated, and I do mean complicated, formula for determining where the dollars go and how much is spent. A lot of the things that schools need right now, computers, better teachers, newer teachers, more teachers, especially in the rural areas, it's very hard to get it's easy to get a good education, but there aren't enough teachers to go around, apparently.
That's very true.
Is this going to solve any of that?
Well, the whole premise of the McCleary decision was to ensure that the schools and school districts had adequate and appropriate funding to be able to accomplish the things that they needed to do. And we needed to create equity and parity across the state. That was the real complication of McCleary. How do you take 295 school districts of various sizes and various spectrums and fit them all into the same shoebox? It's almost impossible. And as we've seen with some of the growing pains in the McCleary decision, we still have a ways to go to work out the final policy. I think funding is there, but policy is another question. How do we continue to make sure that every student in our state has the same opportunities? Because I expect, and I've gotten some criticism from folks on this, but I expect that the students in my district have the same access and success rates that the students do in Bellevue or downtown Seattle. And I don't think that's unreasonable.
No way.
If the state is responsible for funding education, then we should make sure that these students across our state, regardless of the legislative district they're living in, have the same access to education and resources that every other student does.
And, of course, we've done something in Washington that none of the other states in the union have done, and that is we made this part of our Constitution.
That's right. So it's the very first point in the Constitution.
And no other state will ever do that now.
Yeah, I don't think that, I think that how we approach education, and I'm proud of the way in which we approach education here in Washington State, but I definitely think it's very different than any other state. And I do think they looked at Washington and have been following this issue in Washington State and said, we hope to avoid those sorts of pitfalls in the future because it's a very expensive proposition, and not that it isn't something we should be spending money on, but again, over 50% of the entire general fund budget is devoted now to education.
And now you know how hard it is to satisfy the Supreme Court with the solutions that are made in Olympia, but judged elsewhere from behind the bench, and that was a tough one.
That is a tough one, and I'm glad you bring that up because one of the things that was a struggle over the last two legislative sessions and even the special sessions in between, what we were seeing is the reaction by the legislature in having to deal with policy that was laid out by the Supreme Court. Now, the legislature exists for a very real purpose. The purpose of the legislature is to take in comment and public voice and turn that into policy that works, to have transparency in that process as we build policy so that people can come, testify, talk with their local legislators. We can meet with our constituents and find out what they really need. But when you have something like this coming directly from the Supreme Court, you circumvent that entire transparent process, and that really causes a backlog, as you've seen in the legislature with both Hearst and the McCleary decision.
Checks and balances.
Checks and balances.
It's the way it was meant to be, but it's a tough game to play that way.
Mm-hmm.
Our guest is Mike Steele. He's both candidate and incumbent for the 12th Legislative District, and I know that it's been a busy time for you. What do you remember from your first time now in office that we've talked about some important issues, mm-hmm. but what is it that sticks in your mind as an important day in your career?
Well, I've been very fortunate to be involved in some significant statewide decisions that I take some significant pride in. Of course, with the capital budget and serving on that committee, we've increased and invested historic amounts in mental health and mental health facilities across this state, which I think is a huge area of importance. I've supported and helped create policy for new generations and the next generations of students around education. I want to continue that work. I'm also very proud of the work I did with the disabled community and the governor's office and the Office of Civil Rights around the service animal legislation, the first, really the second of its kind in the country. So that's very, very exciting. And
roll that out for some people who think that taking a peacock on a plane is okay.
Well, these animals are designed for are trained for a very real purpose. And that purpose is to have folks with real disabilities access to life, really. That's how I look at it. These folks with disabilities, with these animals that have been highly trained, work and serve very serious purpose so that those folks who have them can access life and work on a daily basis and be part of a community in which they live. And for folks who abuse that privilege or abuse those laws that are set out to protect the disabled community, it causes real problems for that disabled community, because if you're trying to take a peacock on a plane, for example, they're going to ban all animals as opposed to just the ones that are faking it, if you will.
Sure.
And that was a real hard area of conversation, because, the big buzz around this is, of course, emotional support animals. Well, the law really doesn't speak to those emotional support animals. If your animal enters an area of business or a place of business that's public, as long as that animal behaves correctly and doesn't disrupt the area it's in, no one's going to make a fuss. But what we were seeing is these animals were coming in, they were biting, they were barking, they were disrupting, and there was no mechanism to have those folks leave, because they're claiming to be a service animal, and in fact they weren't, but those owners of those establishments or folks working in those public places had no way to move those animals out. All the law did was simply make a new civil infraction that allows folks to potentially be penalized up to $500 if they misrepresent that service animal.
Now that you've done this for a couple of years, is it more work than you thought, less work than you thought, different work tthan you thought? Or, when you're a disc jockey, people say, God, that must be fun. You say, it's not what you think.
Right.
I'm sure it must be the same way in Olympia.
Well, I think being in the legislature and being a disc jockey are probably the same, No.
Without all the riffraff.
That's right. I find the work to be very, very rewarding. What folks, I think, what I sometimes take for granted and what I took for granted before I was in the legislature is just how intense the schedule is for a part-time position. You try to be out there and of course, representing one of the largest geographic districts in the state, there's a lot of travel associated with meeting folks. And I make it a top priority to meet with anyone and everyone that wants to see me. And I make it to every community event that I'm aware of. I try to make it to every community parade, and do that not on an election year, but all the time, because I believe if you're going to serve effectively in this office, you have to be accessible, and people have to see you and they have to know that you're committed to the community. Ultimately, for me, this is not about reelection. This is about representing and serving the people that I love and the community that I was brought up in, and making sure that I can make a difference in a positive way for generations to come. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, when I leave this seat, they may or may not remember that I was ever there, but they can look back and say, hey, we made some big differences in those years, and we know that the community was better off because of the people serving in the legislature. So
you spend more time in Snoqualmie Pass than I did, and we can just call Mike Steele and say, what's the conditions up there, Mike? I'm going through right now on my way to Olympia.
That's right.
It's clear, but a little snow on the sidewalk.
That's right.
What about the idea of serving your community? Did they want something from you that surprised you? Did they call? Did they write? Did they message you in other ways saying, Mike, you'll never guess, but here's what I need?
Well, the benefit I think we have in the 12th Legislative District is that we are very engaged. I feel like even though, we're 4 or 5 hours away from the Capitol as the road goes, it's those folks that have come over and continued to come over and advocate for their policies or their positions on things that really make a difference. And I would venture to guess there are very few legislative districts that are as active or engaged as our district. People know who we are as legislators. They're very free about sharing their opinion, which I appreciate. And I've always said to people, look, public policy is hard. And there are multiple perspectives in public policy. So are we always going to agree? No. But because I believe in the art of negotiation and I believe in the art of conversation, I believe at the end of the day, even if we don't get to center or we don't get to agreement, we should still be able at the end of the day to communicate with one another and maintain those relationships, which are so important because we all believe we're trying to do the right thing. And that's the most important thing. How we get there, the strategy to arrive at the same place is often different, but usually the end goal is the same. Are we making a positive difference for the people that we're elected to represent?
Was it easy for you to reach out to the Democrats, or was it easy for them to reach out for you the first time when you were learning the ropes, saying, I need your help on this. Can you help me with this?
Absolutely. I think I've been, I've come to be a voice of reason in the legislature.
What?
Not to pat myself on the back, but I'm not afraid.
If that's true, and I'm certain it is, you deserve a pat on the back. Anyone who's a voice of reason gets my vote.
Well, I appreciate that. I really believe that I've worked really hard to bridge the gap. I've worked really hard to cross the aisle, and I've worked really hard to understand perspective and the perspective of others. And again, as I said, we may not always agree at the end of the day when it's time to cast our vote, because this is representative government. My job is not to go over there and press my own agenda. My job is to go over there and serve the people that have elected me and vote the way in which they'd have me vote. The majority of the people in this district, how do they want me to vote? What are they telling me? What are they sharing with me? What matters most to them? That's how I'm supposed to vote.
What do you think matters most to your constituents? I mean, everyone wants to be safe. Everyone wants to be healthy. But those aren't really political points. I mean, our quality of life is something that we want to ensure is always there.
Well, I think everybody wants access to a decent paying job. I think everybody wants to be employed should be. I think everybody that wants access to a good education should have it. And I think there is a role of the state. I think we have a responsibility for good infrastructure, for public safety, for all of those things. And that's, we often get caught up between the differences between the state politics and the federal politics. And for me, the most rewarding thing about the state and serving in the legislature is that you can see the things that you're doing almost immediately. They have an immediate impact on these communities. We're building bridges. We're securing public safety grants. We're creating opportunity to mitigate more fire and wildfires. We're working actively in the legislature to make sure that people in our district have what they need to feel like they're safe, happy, and healthy. And I think that's really the basic premise of service in the legislature. You
brought up the word fire, and it just occurred to me, we've had a lot of small ones. We haven't had a real fire yet. I'm guessing that one is coming. I hope it doesn't. But that fire season is longer than ever. I don't have to tell you any of this. I don't have to tell anyone. There's no preamble to it. Right. How are we going to change the way we live because of the way the fires are burning differently?
Well, I just attended a meeting last week with the governor and several stakeholders. He was here in the district, and the whole premise of the meeting was fire-educated networks and fire-wise communities, and how are we going to interface with that urban-rural and urban wildland connection? How do we make sure that as communities we're prepared for the next event? And also, as state lawmakers, how do we ensure that we're doing as much as we can to mitigate another event ever happening? And for me, we've worked on, since I've been in the legislature, I've worked on several pieces of legislation that are designed to help better manage our forest. And I think we need to continue to focus on that. We need to continue to be good stewards of that land so that we don't end up in major catastrophic fire situations again. Because really, it's scary and it's economically devastating to the state of Washington, and we need to figure out a way to better resource those folks that are doing a good job managing our forest.
Got some folks in here this week or last week, it all starts to run together for me, forgive me, from the Upper Columbia Collaborative, and they're going to put aside 75,000 acres near Lake Chelan, thin the forest in a plan to show how it's done. Now that is a great idea.
It's a great idea.
But it's expensive.
Yes.
And it has to be rolled out to like 12 western states.
It's expensive, but it's less expensive than a catastrophic fire and dealing with the costs associated with it.
And they have a good plan, I think.
They do. I've just sort of seen the draft plans at this point, and the conversations have been happening. I'm very excited. Anything we can do to mitigate, again, the opportunities for a catastrophic fire to hit our communities is really important. Because, look, it's not just about the fire and the cost of fighting that fire. It's about the economic devastation that occurs around it. And I've lived through it, been the executive director at the Lake Chelan Chamber of Commerce for 12 years.
Smoky skies, no tourists.
Smoky skies, no tourists. Smoky skies, no spending happening. Smoky skies, the outdoor recreation and the activities that even the locals enjoy aren't happening.
That's right.
So this is really an important thing that we need to get a hold of, and we need to continue working on as it relates to policy.
Our guest is Mike Steele. He's the candidate and the incumbent for the 12th Legislative District. When you started doing the work here in Olympia, what was it that you said, oh, I like this? This is the part I like the best.
I think my favorite committee, if you will, has been it's sort of a toss-up between two, but I've really enjoyed the work that I've done on capital budget, mostly because it has a direct correlation back to my time on city council. I can see how things like the Public Works Trust Fund directly impact local abilities to fund infrastructure, and that's a responsibility of the capital budget. I can see how local levies and bonds that are passed in these school districts are directly impacted by the School Construction Assistance Program that is a capital budget function. I've toured schools from all over the state now in my capacity as a legislator, and I can see how capital budget money is influencing the construction of these new schools. Technology and economic development, right up my alley, of course, as someone who has been serving the community through economic development for the last 12 years. That's been a really exciting committee as well. That's a committee where we get to see a lot of the groundbreaking and new additions to technology that are taking place not only at the state level, but across the country, and looking at opportunities for new and enhanced economic development that aren't your run-of-the-mill. So what technology and economic development are doing to interface and how we can grow those industries. Very, very exciting. You know, we are a leader in a lot of respects here in the 12th District. The Central Washington Legislative District is something that so many legislators in my time now at the legislature have commented and said, we're so amazed at the things you guys are doing. We're so amazed at the innovation. We're so amazed at the communities you've created. We're so amazed at the quality of schools you're building. And that I take with a whole lot of pride, and know that the communities around the 12th Legislative District have really stepped up and are doing some pretty amazing things. And it's really fun to show those off at the legislature and to use those as examples of what can be done across the state.
Mike Steele, if you're in the 12th Legislative District, your representative's here in our studio. Mike Steele is here. Mike, we're just about out of time, but would you ask your constituents for the vote?
Absolutely. You know, there's a lot of work left to be done, as I've said. I'm excited to go back and continue the good policy work that I think I've done. And as I've mentioned, I've worked really hard to represent the multitude of perspectives that exist in the 12th Legislative District, and try and always vote on behalf of the constituent in a way that I know is going to be the way they want, but also the way that's going to positively impact their lives.
Nice to meet you.